Hi everyone, let's talk about thesis statements today. Of course, what is a thesis statement? So it's a statement of the position, point of view, or belief of the entire essay. So the thesis statement defines the whole essay. Nothing should go in that essay that doesn't help show or prove that thesis to be true. It states clearly and specifically the writer's central point, so the main idea or position the rest of the composition will support and discuss. So it's your position statement, and then the rest of the essay develops that position, discusses that position, or gives examples or evidence of that position. You can also think of the thesis as a summary of the whole essay. It's almost always one sentence, especially when you're writing smaller types of papers or compositions. Once you get to like a 20-page paper, you may have a couple sentences for your thesis, but generally it should be a one-sentence summary of what the whole essay will then go on to discuss. You can also think of the thesis as the answer to the question of the prompt. So specifically in a class where you're given a writing assignment, you probably have an assignment sheet with a prompt on it, and that prompt is usually asking a question. So for example, in an environmental science class, you might have a prompt, what should America do to combat pollution? And your job is to write an essay that responds to that prompt, or even write a paragraph that responds to that prompt, right? Your thesis will be your particular answer to that question. So the way that your claim in response to that question. For example, to combat pollution, the American government should focus efforts on privately owned cars, allowing citizens to invest in and contribute to the outcome. So you can see how it's got that topic, it's rephrased the question as a statement, and then supplied the writer's own answer to that question. Some problems I generally see with thesis statements are covered on these next few slides. So what should a thesis statement not be? You do not want to make it sound like an announcement. So you don't need to say in a paper or a written composition, this paper will explain why, or my opinion is. So that's sort of announcing that you are about to give this paper to us. Just say, the South feels like home to me because, right? That is your insight. That is what you are offering to the audience. You also want to avoid a thesis that's a question, because your paper is not meant to provide the question as its main assertion. An assertion is by definition not a question, right? So instead, you want it to be sort of the answer to that question. You want to avoid just a statement of personal preference. I liked growing up in the South. And that's just because it's not really debatable because it's only your experience, but it's also not really offering anything to the audience. So if you are writing something that you are putting out there for an audience, you want to offer them something too. So you want to make sure your statements, even if it's a personal type of essay, it offers some significance to the reader, and we'll talk about that later on in this same presentation. It should also not just be a fact. Fact is not discussable or debatable, and so therefore there would be no point in writing the essay, right? So I grew up in the South in the 1950s. Again, we need like a so what. We need a statement of why that was significant, what we can learn from your experience there, what you learned from your experience there, something to give it a little more significance as opposed to just a fact. And sort of like the announcement, you don't want to use personal pronouns like in my opinion or I believe, I think. It can kind of sound wimpy because you're trying to make a claim or an assertion or offer us a perspective. So when you say in my opinion, it just makes it sound like you're kind of trying to get out of taking a strong stance. And in a paper, you want to sound authoritative because that will help build your ethos. You don't want to sound wimpy or unsure of what you're trying to say, or like you're trying to excuse the fact that you have a strong opinion on something. So, on the other hand, here's what a good thesis should do. So I've got it color-coded here, a few really important things that we know a good thesis should do. Pretty much regardless of the type of paper, type of prompt, type of composition, type of assignment, a good thesis will generally do these things. So it should, of course, explain the author's position or perspective, not just the topic or the subject, but what the author is saying about that topic or subject. It should make a significant claim, so it should be strong and debatable or discussable. So, if you're not writing an argument paper, it might not be debatable, but it should be discussable. It should also be specific. Generally, that means it should include some sort of reasoning as to how or why you believe this thing to be true. And it should have some sort of significance to the audience. It should imply why it matters. So here's an example of a thesis that does those things. You can see here in red is the author's position or perspective, and it makes a discussable or debatable claim. It's got some specifics, so not just they stereotype women, but specifically as passive, right? So it gets a little more clear and specific as to what particular type of stereotype the paper or composition would discuss. And finally, well, why does that matter? We have an implication as to why this is important to talk about. It creates and perpetuates sexist views in their target audiences.